Good evening. This is Michael Wong. I'm the National Vice President of Veterans for Peace, and I'm also the co-chair of the Veterans China Working Group. This evening we have with us Professor John Walsh. Until recently, he was a professor of physiology and neuroscience at the University of Massachusetts in the Chan Medical School. He's since retired and he's now working on issues of peace and healthcare. He's written for the San Francisco Chronicle, the East BayTimes, San Jose Mercury News, Asia Times, LA Progressive, antiwar.com, CounterPunch, and others. Welcome, John Walsh. And I wanted to let people see one of the articles that he's written that I think is really quite an outstanding article. It's this one right here. Whoops, hang on. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to share screen. And this is the article. So I'd like everybody to see it. And the title of the article is World War II Redux, the Endpoint of US Policy. John, could you tell us about this article, maybe give us a little summary of it, and then we'll talk about it from there.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me, Mike, and thanks for doing all this for VFP. I know it's a lot of work, and it's great of you to do it. So I wrote this article on the eve of, actually on February 18th, 2022, on the eve of, I wouldn't say on the eve of the war in Ukraine, because I think the war in Ukraine began not in 2022, but in 2014, after the U.S. sponsored coup, the installation of a U.S. controlled regime, more or less, and the shelling of the people of the Russian-speaking region of the Donbass, which took 14,000 lives between 2014 and 2022, when Russia responded militarily. So, but this was written on the eve of that response. I just looked at the date today. It was written on February 18th. And it's interesting to note some of the responses going into that. And actually, I began the article with something that Zelensky said at the time. He said he wasn't happy with the push he was getting from the United States at that time, and he berated the United States a little bit for pounding the drums of war. And he said, "This is not going to be a war of Ukraine and Russia. This is going to be a European war, a full-fledged war." I think that that's where we're headed. I don't think we've arrived at it completely yet. I think there's many more chapters to be written in that if the United States and the neocons get their way. At the same time, or a short time before that, then president of and I think, just to go back to Zelensky's word, that probably struck fear into the hearts of many Europeans who still have memory of World War II and the millions and millions of people who died in that, 27 million Russians, millions of Europeans, and they knew what it could mean. Actually, given that memory, maybe it's fading. I'm a little bit surprised at the response, but at any rate, at roughly the same time, over on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, then Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte was saying, thinking about the possibility of a war on that side of the globe between China and the United States. He said, he used an old African proverb. He said, "When elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled flat." And that certainly is true. And that was certainly true in Europe. So it was true in Asia too, because forgotten often is the fact that tens of millions of Chinese perished holding the Japanese down while making it much easier for the United States to invade and quote unquote defeat the Japanese. So at any rate, it's clear, and we've been at it for a year now, that the United States at that time was stoking tensions in both Europe and East Asia. And I wrote at the time that Ukraine and in East Asia, Taiwan were the flashpoints, and that has turned out to be the case. Now, the United States makes no secret that it has major enemies, and among those enemies, topping the list is China and Russia. And we can ask right off the bat, taking a simple view of things, why are China and Russia enemies? What has China ever done to us except provide us with cheap goods of high quality, preventing us from having more inflation? What has Russia ever done to us? It provides our friends in Europe with cheap oil, which has made them prosper, made German industry, which is the heart of the EU, one of the leading industrial powers in the world. What's up with that? I mean, I think you have to ask that. And I think to get an answer to that, a partial answer, we have to go back to 1941, just before the United States entered World War II. And viewing the World War II, which was already underway, both in Europe, well underway, and in Asia, both well underway, with the Japanese occupying China, with Hitler marching here and there across the European continent, and having begun an intense war on Russia. The war was with it and was in full blossom, if you will, and we were not in it. At that time, so the foreign policy lead at that time looked at what was happening, and they developed the idea that after the Second World War, all the great industrial powers would be laid waste, and the United States would be on top of the heap, alone, having the ability to dominate. And that was, all this is documented in a wonderful book by Stephen Wertheim of the Quincy Institute called, the book came out in 2020 called Tomorrow the World, The Birth of US Global Supremacy. It's well worth the read. So this view got its first popular expression in 1941 in an essay by Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time magazine, and it was called The American Century. Many people think the American century idea developed after World War II. No, it was before World War II. And he wrote this. He said the American century was laid out before him, and he says in this American century, he enjoined the U.S., quote, to accept wholeheartedly our duty and our opportunity as the most powerful nation in the world, and in consequence, to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit, and by such means as we see fit. That's the first definition that I know of the rules-based order. And so this is the first expression of this. This is the idea of global hegemony. Sometimes we think of that as the creation of the present-day neocons, but it goes back to this period. I mean, before that, the United States had, the conquest of the Philippines, the Monroe Doctrine. It was an imperial power, but now it aspired to something much more, to dominate the globe, the world. And after World War II, when indeed it happened that we were left standing and all the rest was pretty much wrecked, that policy was reiterated, and that this time it was by George Kennan, who was, the principal architect of post-war U.S. foreign policy. And he wrote in 1948 this. He says, furthermore, again, this is another statement of the goal of hegemony. Furthermore, we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great. Now, this is interesting. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. Our real task in the coming period is to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. So no sentimentality, no altruism, no doing good in the world. We have to maintain this inequality. So there's another expression of it. And I think, and the only thing that still stood in the way after that, of that goal of worldwide hegemony and disparity, was the Soviet Union. After the Soviet, so that policy held until the Soviet Union collapsed. And then we got another statement of the same thing in the Wolfowitz doctrine, which I think many people know about. Paul Wolfowitz wrote this in his so-called doctrine in 1992, just before Clinton came into power, when George H.W. Bush was still in power. And I'll sum it up this way, or read it, quote from it. It said that the U.S.'s, quote, first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere. That's a quote. Went on to state that no regional power must be allowed to emerge with the power and resources sufficient to generate global power. There could be no other global power. And it concludes in a very frank fashion, we must maintain the mechanism for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global power. So no more regional power, because other than the US, because that can quickly grow into a global power. And that's where we are now. And we see now the United States threatened with two rivals, peer competitors, who are capable of being regional powers, although they've shown no sign of going beyond that: Russia and China. And so we have these proxy wars that were ginned up by the United States, first in Ukraine, now in Taiwan. And when we ask why, we have our answer. It is part of U.S. policy that we prevent these powers from becoming a power that can possibly challenge the United States, and a power that would not be subservient to the United States, because the goal here is to make sure that no one can get to be so powerful as to challenge the United States. Now, this is especially relevant to China, because China, in a sense, has already eclipsed the United States. I mean, China is the #1 by PPP GDP. It's substantially larger than the United States already. So it's certainly a competitor if you feel that you have to be #1. And now Russia and China, over the years, I would say, especially since maybe 2012, 2013, have become pretty solid allies. So now the United States is confronted with the two peer competitors who are working together. So how does the United States react to this? With these two regional wars, the proxy wars that it's ginned up, how does that work out? Specifically, if you look at China, the historian Alfred McCoy says that the United States has a real problem there, because if it comes to a military competition, what he calls the tyranny of distance prevents the United States from militarily defeating China in East Asia, close to its shores, or on its very territory. So what is the answer to this? Well, the answer to this is exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine. The answer to this is what happened in World War II. The answer is which is how it turned out in World War II. You could say, did the United States plan this? Well, in a certain sense it did, because what happened in looking at Europe is that Russia, the Soviet Union, fought the Western Europeans, and at the end, both of them were ruined. The United States stepped in. We stepped in on the side of the Western Europeans, but along the way, President Truman kept saying, you know, if the fascists were winning, we should support the Europeans, and if the Europeans were winning, we should support the fascists. The idea there was to weaken them both. Now, how conscious was that? That's the way it worked out. And actually, and at the end, the United States left standing after the other powers fought one another, losing millions of lives, as I said before. Same thing happened in East Asia. China valiantly fought the invasion by Japan, tying it down. China wasn't an industrial power at the time, but it did more than anything else to defeat Japan. And Japan also was destroyed at the end of that. And what happened? The United States emerged as the power that could dominate the globe. Well, what I see happening in Europe and in East Asia is the same thing all over again. That if full-scale war breaks out in both places, between countries that the United States is allied with versus Russia in the West, and countries that the United States is allied with in the East, the same thing will happen again, and the United States will be the unchallenged hegemon. Now, the situation in the West doesn't look too good, because what I would call the Western European vassal states seem to be going right along with it, even though they've suffered great damage. I mean, when the United States, it seems, blew up Nord Stream pipelines, that was a blow to Germany as an industrial power. I mean, it hurts, and Germany and industrialists understand that. So you would have thought, given the great damage that would be done and is being done to the European economies, they would have said, no, we don't want to be part of that. But they have come along under US pressure. Will the East Asian powers, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, really a part of China? Make no mistake about that, but there is a secessionist movement there. Will they throw in with the United States? Well, there's signs they might, but let's hope they don't. Otherwise, East Asia will suffer the same fate that it did at the end of World War II. So I think that's what I mean by World War II redux. The United States, I think, sees this as the blueprint, sees World War II as the blueprint for the way forward. Now, how conscious is this, or is this something that automatically grows out of the existing situation? I don't know. But clearly, the way the United States defines its goals and the way the United States has been acting, this is as I call it, the end point of what the United States is up to here. And besides the peoples of East Asia and Western Europe, of course, the people of the United States could put a stop to this too. But so far, I wouldn't say there's a little bit of movement of that, bipartisan actually, in terms of Ukraine, where Ukraine is concerned, but not sufficient to stop it. So one more thing I might add, as compared to World War II, although not at the very end, today this kind of confrontation between the United States and its allies with Russia or China risks nuclear war. Well, the people in power seem to be willing to risk that. It boggles the mind to believe that, but that has to be the case, because they're acting in such a way as to move us towards possible nuclear war. And the United States actually has a history of nuclear brinksmanship, as they used to call it during the Cold War. So that's where we stand. That's where I saw things standing at that time. That's how I saw it then. I think that's a fair summary.
Okay, thanks, John. That's a very good explanation of exactly what your article was about. It lays out this whole game plan that the United States has for dominating the world by basically manipulating different countries and playing them against each other, causing them to fight each other, destroy each other, and leave the United States as the one superpower standing. And certainly that seems to be what's going on in Asia, as well as Europe. They're playing Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, and weakening all of Europe in the process, as well as waging war on Russia. And, as you've described, they're doing the same thing in Asia. They're putting up Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and whoever else they can rope in as proxies against China. And if there should be a war, just as you describe, obviously they would devastate each other. And unless China were to hit the mainland, or if North Korea were to hit the American mainland, otherwise, obviously the United States would be the only major power standing at the end of such a war. I know you've had some thoughts about this since writing that article. That article was written more than a year ago, February 2022. What thoughts have you had about the situation since you wrote that article?
I guess one thing I should say is that in terms of people in the United States, in terms of the peace movement, first of all, I just wanted to say that, people attach a lot of mystery to what's going on. How is this happening in Ukraine? How can we make sense of this? Where does it come from? But very, very rarely do I find this history of United States policy raised. It's all too often that things essentially began in February 2022. There was some, in the standard telling of it, there were some machinations of leading up to February 2022 on the part of the West. We did things that helped to cause this, but there is nowhere near, there's not the full recognition of how consciously the United States is doing this. There is no, very little recognition, as I see it, of what the drive for hegemony means, global hegemony. And the Chinese, on the other hand, one of the most recent papers that their foreign ministry has put out is built around the idea of U.S. hegemony. It's hegemony in military, hegemony economically, hegemony in soft power, again and again and again. I think 12 categories of how the U.S. is fighting, is trying to drive a global hegemonic order. We don't see that, and we don't emphasize that. And I think that's kind of a subtle US exceptionalism. And in any event, where are we now? I think something, I think China has turned out to be more than a peer competitor. I think China has not only outstripped the United States economically, which means, since economic power is ultimately the basis of all power, soft power, military power, all power, it's not only outstripped the United States in economically, considerably in PPP GDP, but it has, I mean, you know, it's well known, this is said again and again, China is, in terms of manufacturing, its manufacturing capability is bigger than the US and the EU combined. Its trading activities in the world are greater by far than the United States. It's an awesome power, and it not only serves, it is powerful enough that it is able to provide an alternative for countries that are have been forced to submit to US hegemony. I think first and foremost, I think Russia. I do not believe Russia could be standing up to the United States if it didn't have China behind it, not providing weapons, not providing soldiers, but willing to trade with it, willing to do business with it, refusing to condemn it. And because China does that, India does that. There's China providing an alternative. It says, we're doing it. And India says, well, geez, it's in our interest to do the same, so we can do that too. It's provided an alternative. I think same with a lot of other countries like Iran that have been under the gun of the United States. So China really is providing this alternative. And in providing this alternative, it has laid the groundwork for a multipolar world, which we all talk about now. It's either a hegemonic world or a multipolar world. China and Russia advocate for multipolarity. The United States advocates for hegemony. And China actually cannot really say, well, you know, we have enough economic power, we don't need any more. No, China can't do that. It cannot. If China wants to, if the Chinese people are to have the same standard of living as the people in the West, since they have, or people in the United States, let's say, since China has 4 times the population of the United States, its GDP is going to be 4 times greater. And unless they give up any aspiration to have the same standard of living, and why should anybody give that up? Maybe they can do it more effectively. Maybe China will be more less wasteful, but still 2 or 3 times the GDP of the United States. And the United States is not a power any longer that can dictate to China or tell it to stop supporting other poles in the world. So it's come to a point, if the United States, the only way it can remain a hegemon and is to re-impoverish China. It can't let China have the standard of living. It must somehow or other re-impoverish it. And that's what we see happening. You know, the polite word for it is containment, but the proper word for it is poverty. And so because the United States, because it must be number one, you know, not that the United States can't be prosperous and live at peace in a multipolar world, but if it demands to be the number one economic power, it will be in conflict. So I think that China has changed the world really, and changed the capability of the United States. one thing I should say, I guess this is the reality of the world. This is the reality. On the other hand, there is this narrative, this fiction the United States is putting out, and grabs a lot of people, that the real struggle here is between democracy and authoritarianism. Now, for democracy and sovereignty, the United States is protecting sovereignty of other countries versus authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is just another word for saying that country is our enemy. U.S. doesn't defend democracy; it defends Israel, which is an apartheid state. That's not democracy. It's long defended many ruthless dictatorships. It is not a power that wants to defend democracy, and it is not a power that stands for sovereignty either. Because if you think if anybody who says that should, I will listen to them when they can convince the Iraqi people and the Libyan people and the Syrian people and many others, the Somalian people, that the United States stands for sovereignty. So that's a fiction. The real struggle here is that between the people of the world who want to have a decent life, aspire to a standard of living that the West has gained, and the U.S. hegemon. That's what's going on. I mean, it's and so in a real sense, you could ask, and as Ray McGovern often says, there's a racial dimension to that. The garden, which is Josep Borrell's, the chief diplomat for the EU, that's his word for the EU and the United States. The garden, this garden, the civilized garden. Out there, there's the jungle. The rest of the world is the jungle, and the garden has to make sure that the jungle doesn't do anything wrong. So, let's face it, what is he talking about there? Basically, he's talking about people of color. He's talking about, and so in a sense, these wars that the United States these wars that it is ginning up, they're racist wars. And people should be asked when they say, they say, well, I'm for war in Ukraine. I'm for us getting at Russia or China. Which side are you on? This is a nasty attempt for the ex-colonial powers to reassert themselves. That's the truth. So somebody says, I'm for Ukraine. You say, well, what does that really mean? I hate Russia. What does that really mean? I hate China. What does that really mean? There's a very racial connotation to all that, and I think that's a very good insight of Ray McGovern's and many other people, I suppose.
Great, John. Thanks a lot. That's a very good summary of the current world situation. And certainly, we see this again and again. And one example after another of the United States invading another nation and another nation and another nation. We've, at the end of the Cold War, we've been constantly at war. I don't know how many wars and how many different nations we've attacked in one way or another since the end of the Cold War. It's when I look back at history, if you look back at Western history, it starts out in Europe, and Europe in ancient times was a series of small countries together on a continent, constantly making war on each other, and one country conquering another and building an empire, and the empire expanding, and then eventually they reach the limits of sustainability. They overreach themselves, the empire falls, and then you have another period of chaos with different warring states fighting each other, all in the context of Europe. And out of that history, people have developed this concept of the zero-sum game, that either you are the conqueror or you are the victim. Of course, nobody wants to be the victim, so therefore they feel they have no choice but to be a conqueror. And you hear people in Washington talk about the Chinese intend to do this and the Chinese intend to do that. I saw one article where they interviewed General John Olson of the US Space Force, and the article said outright that China's intention is not mere global domination, but galactic domination, the galaxy. There's, 100 billion with a B stars in this galaxy. The idea that China could dominate that or would even think about or want to dominate that is completely ridiculous. If you look back at Chinese history, it's very different from Western history. Chinese history, China's always been just a regional power, and it's prospered by trading with the rest of the world through the ancient Silk Roads, which, at various times went from China to Africa, Black Africa, Southern Africa, which at that time, going back as far as 4,000 years ago, was another center of high culture. They had cities, they had buildings, they had palaces, they had temples, they had, advanced art. They were an advanced civilization, Black Africa at one time, and that's when the Silk Roads went to actually Africa instead of Europe. Later on, when Europe became more advanced, then the Silk Roads ran to Europe. So China's always had more of a concept of being self-sustaining, trading with the rest of the world. And because of that, it's taken a more conservative strategy towards survival, which is to simply keep to yourself and not pick fights with other people, not overextend yourself to the point where it's unsustainable and you have this empire that then collapses and ceases to exist. That's why China has had a continuous culture for 5,000 years. On the other hand, you have Europe, which has had, one empire after another. During the colonial period, different nations rose and fell in power at different times. And now the United States has fallen into that same pattern of playing the zero-sum game. And China keeps talking about, no, it's not zero-sum, it's not win-lose, it's win-win. Like you have to do trade and relationships in a way that everybody wins so that everybody can survive. Have you had any thoughts about that? Are there any comparisons to any schools of thought within the Western world that might be cultivated to be a counterbalance to this hegemonic zero-sum game?
Well, I mean, I know what you're saying, because I think recently, where did this come up?
There's a peace movement.
Well, I'm thinking there were recently, actually I did a piece on this, which I quoted extensively from the British magazine, The Spectator, and the Telegram of also in the UK, saying that the economic war against Russia has failed, the West's economic war. And then it pointed out that China was an economic force that helped to make that possible. But right away, they went to the fact this means that China will rule Russia, that Russia will become a colony of China. They were not able to see that there might be a different way of looking at this. Certainly, China's has a bigger population; it's wealthier, but you don't find Russia complaining about that very much, and you don't find China dictating to Russia either. The economies of the two countries, as a matter of fact, are really complementary. the position they apply, the diplomatic position in the world that they occupy are also complementary. It's not just that Russia has great natural resources and that China is a great manufacturing power. There's a match, but China has Russia, for example. It's really a legacy from the Soviet period, has great diplomatic relations with a country like India. So the border dispute that causes, I think, foolish friction between India and China can be overcome somewhat because Russia has a diplomatic relationship with India that can help. And so does China have a diplomatic relationship with Russia, and that can help to overcome this friction. So there is and you find that in Africa, you find that all around the world. So there is a complementarity. It is in fact a win-win situation. But the British pundits can't see that. All they can see is, oh, Russia's going to be dominated by China. You know, it has to be win-lose, as you said. It can't be win-win. It seems almost like they can't even think of things in those terms. And if we have to go on thinking of terms in win-lose, we're all lost. I mean, sooner or later we'll blow ourselves up. If we can't absorb this idea of mutual benefit, which is on every side of us, if we take advantage of it, then we're lost. And I agree. This idea of win-lose, or this idea of empire, you know, you can take that back. In the case of U.S. hegemony, I can take it back to 1941. The deeper causes of that, you suggest one. You know, the European culture comes from long periods of warring states, and does that explain it? Does that explain Western imperialism? How did it grow into hegemony? There are deeper causes, and you can get into all kinds of. You can take it back to early Christianity. You can take it back to the advent of modern capitalism, but I don't think we have to go that far. I think we can see that it has happened, and it's not necessary, and it's dangerous, and it's not just a function of this crowd of neocons who are now in control. It's been a consistent theme in the United States for 3/4 of a century. So we got to get rid of it. Can we get rid of it without understanding where its roots come from? Well, let's hope so, because I don't think we're going to be able to come to an agreement on that. But yeah, we always have to think of things in terms of win-lose. Can't think of terms in terms of win-win. And it's I would say win-lose is a loser.
Right. Basically win-lose is essentially a form of international Russian roulette.
Yes, it is. I agree. I quite agree. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great summary. Thanks, John. I've really appreciated having you on this program. And let's talk more in the future, and I hope to have you on again.
Okay. Well, again, Mike, thanks for doing this. I know that it's not an easy thing to set up a YouTube channel like this, and I think it's potentially, given the way we're communicating these days, it's a very valuable thing. So thank you.
Okay. We'll talk again sometime soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Whoops. Hang on. Don't go away.